Thank you, everybody. Welcome, everyone, to the first of the Boyce debates. I'd like to recognise some, I shouldn't say old faces, should I? I should say some very familiar faces. But it's also great to see a lot of people here who I don't know. The things we constantly discuss within the disability community is how so often we simply feel as though we're talking to ourselves and not to people who can institute change. I'd like to welcome the speakers for tonight. We have Professor Bob Jackson, Dr. Suzanne Carrington, Dr. Rhonda Farragher, and our facilitator, John Miller from 4BC, who've done a fabulous job in assisting us to promote this evening. I came across a saying 4 or 5 years ago that, to me, perfectly encapsulated my views about what true inclusion for people with disabilities should look like and what the impediments were. And I'm sorry to those of you who've had this said to them a dozen times, but I'm going to say it again. It's by a Norwegian writer and commentator called John Sandven. John wrote, "When a child goes to a special school, it is not because the child has an intellectual impairment, but because the community school does not welcome children with an intellectual impairment." He also wrote, "When a man in a wheelchair cannot enter the bus, it is not because he uses a wheelchair, but because the bus is inaccessible." These, to me, are the problems that we need to get up front and discuss. Last year, I called for special schools in Queensland to be closed, and for all the resources, all the human resources, all the technical resources, all that rich and wonderful knowledge to be moved into supporting children with disabilities in the mainstream system. Now, that certainly caused a strong emotional reaction from many people, both for and against. And one of the most common comments made was that students with disabilities were bullied in mainstream schools and were therefore safer in special schools. But when you unpacked all those comments that people made, it came down to just 3 things that people wanted for their children. Parents want their children's school environment to be safe, to be educational, and to be enjoyable. That's what all of us here want. My contention is that this can only properly happen when we have truly inclusive education. The very first training centre for people with disabilities, it was actually for blind people, was opened in Queensland in the 1890s. And the first special school, as we now call them, and with the same sort of pedagogy, opened in 1923. In my view, it's now time, in Queensland's 150th anniversary year, to move on to the next phase of real inclusiveness. Issues towards disability, towards discrimination and human rights have changed radically and for the better in the past 150 years. But what are we saying to our next generation about discrimination and about inclusion every time a special bus full of special students drives straight past their school to go to a special school? It's time, in my view, that our actions match our rhetoric. The first of the Boyce debates tonight, making inclusive education work, is it the will, is it the skill, or is it what's in the till, is my attempt to move this conversation a bit further forward. I'd like to thank you very much for coming, and I'd like to introduce our facilitator for this evening, John Miller. He probably needs very little introduction to most people in the audience tonight. John has been a career radio and TV producer and broadcaster for almost 35 years. He was educated at Brisbane's Villanova College and attended the University of Queensland for a short period until he gained a cadetship in radio journalism, as there was in those days no journalism course. Since then, John has worked as a reporter, news editor for radio stations 4IP, 4BK and 2UE in Sydney, and he's worked on assignment in the United States, the UK, Israel and the Far East. He has also worked as executive producer for television current affairs for the 7 Network, before moving on to produce a long series of documentaries for the world around us. Most recently, John has worked as a presenter and commentator for Radio 4BC, and he's recently completed a 13-part series for 9 and Win TV called Inside Queensland, which he co-wrote, produced and presented with Bruce Page. This was designed to honour our state's unsung heroes, and the series was viewed by just over 2.6 million Queenslanders, not bad when you consider the population, and is expected to return over the summer period this year. Please join me in welcoming our facilitator, John Miller.